Forget not beauty. Forget not beauty, lest she pass you by and leave you as she found you.
Arthur DaCosta was a 20th century American painter and a much revered art professor at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts from 1966 through 1988. His keen interest in pre-Modernist art drove him to a lifelong study of classical painting materials and techniques. He fervently believed that technical mastery expanded a painter's range of aesthetic possibilities. Sharing his research, both technical and aesthetic, with students became his passion.
And you notice I am not mixing prismatic colors with prismatic colors, but in each case I'm mixing an earth color with a prismatic color. And I'm extending the palette that way. One of the hardest things to learn, and everyone, you have to learn it for yourself. I'll show you this, but this isn't anything you're going to live with for very long, because it gets to be a very personal kind of thing, developing a palette.
Mr. DaCosta was born in New York City on August 19, 1921, but he grew up largely in Philadelphia. Of his early education, little is known. During World War II, Arthur DaCosta served for 3 years with the 8th United States Air Force in England. As an artist with special services in the 355th Fighting Group, he created designs and painted portraits. On returning to Philadelphia after the war, Mr. DaCosta entered the Mural Arts program of the Pennsylvania Academy, from which he graduated in 1948. At the Academy, he became a master draftsman. Using a variety of approaches, he would continue drawing the figure and other subjects for the rest of his life. He married Charlotte Brown, who he had met while serving in England during the war. It was a love story that would last for the rest of their lives. Mr. DaCosta was primarily recognized for his still life paintings and his portraits, but he also painted countless small figure studies, which very few people have ever seen. His legacy lies just as strongly with the accomplishments of his many students as it does with his own beautifully crafted paintings and drawings. Though he never interfered with a student's developing style, be it representational or abstract, he clearly loved the arc of painterly realism, going from Titian in the Renaissance and continuing through the 18th and 19th centuries. He believed not in painting things, but the air, the atmosphere that surrounds things. He believed that this tradition could and should be accessible to art students of the 20th century. And he showed with great precision how these concepts and techniques could be used. The variety and artistic merit of the many students who learned from him is astonishing. Not every student agreed with his aesthetics, and some did not even like his paintings. But everyone who was lucky enough to have him as a teacher or just get to know him found that their creative lives were greatly enriched. As we listen to the voices of some of his students, we will see their work, not his, which is how he would have wanted it.
Arthur DaCosta was a master of explaining painterly technique, but his greatest gift to me was not technical. Rather, it was how to begin to pay attention to the visual world, to see clearly what was right in front of my eyes, and then how to name it, both verbally and with form, using the hands to move paint. One day, Arthur said, "Kid, in the biblical story, the first thing God did was to separate the night from day, and that's your job here, to divide the dark from light." And in that moment, he defined a path for me, a conceptual notion of direction and purpose. Arthur was a major voice of encouragement for me. In the decade after school, when my paintings began to slowly turn off the road into something else, away from whom I had been as a student, he was always there encouraging me to keep going and to see where the adventure went. And his mentoring went much further into the business of how an artist lives. And that was expressed in the many social gatherings that he offered to us at his home in Marion Station, where he and his warm wife, Charlotte, and later his brother-in-law, Palmer, made us always feel welcome. Flowers, fabric, food, and music were extremely important to him, and much of that was conveyed to us as a way of life. At the end of every semester, Arthur would bake something and bring it to the class to celebrate the close of the semester. And there's nothing like a delicious homemade carrot cake to let us know the love and care he felt for us.
I attended the Pennsylvania Academy from 1979 till 1983. Arthur DaCosta was an amazing person that had a big influence on me while I was at the Academy. I actually never took a class with him, but I ate lunch with him virtually every day. We had the best conversations during that time. I never met a person who was so articulate in regard to describing the technical procedures of painting. He did it with such care and with such clarity of language that the ideas that he spoke about during those lunch encounters have remained with me throughout my entire life. There are certain things that I'll always remember he said. One was in regard to the organization of the light mass. Another thing he said is that there's a certain logic to the paint, and when you interfere with the logic of the paint, you create a confusing effect. One time someone I know asked him to teach him how to glaze, and Arthur's response to him was, "You're too young to glaze," which I thought was very funny. But he was truly a great man, a real wizard, and going into his studio was like going into Merlin's laboratory. All sorts of concoctions and experiments regarding color and permanency. And of course, he was the inventor of that great substance, now difficult, if not impossible to find, turco, which was an alkyd medium that dried fast and really was the forerunner of liquid. If I could compare him to one person, it would be to Sir Charles Locke Eastlake, whose writing on painting was very similar in the accuracy of its effect in describing the particulars of painting technique. DaCosta was a great man, a really great man, and I'll always be indebted to him for the wonderful conversations.
I started Academy in 1976. I just finished high school. I had absolutely no instruction in oil painting when I started. Watching Arthur demonstrate was just a revelation to me, really magical. I think most of us painters are visual learners, and having someone walk us through the painting process was of great benefit. I loved Arthur's tone. He was always very encouraging. It was a wonderful atmosphere in his class. It made the information easy to absorb because it was focused on you interacting with a model and trying to create a painting. And these were steps that would help you gain success in your endeavor. I really made an effort to be in one of Arthur's class throughout my 4 years at the Academy. I remember seeing Arthur's studio and just being struck by the atmospheric qualities that Arthur was able to convey. That glowing light, that glowing color, that tenderness, really, of description of form that was laced with poetry. I thought this was a very high aesthetic. For the past 3 decades, I've devoted most of my time to still life. I remember staring at Arthur's cupboard squash and rose, being transported into this other realm, thinking, this is a rose, but there's this sort of pure magic in it. It's like experiencing for the first time, like you don't know what it even is, what its name is. Perhaps people who didn't know him would think that he taught technique. Arthur actually did not teach technique, but Arthur was very focused on the principles of painting, regardless of style, of your style. Because Arthur didn't teach technique, all of us have found our own personal ways of stating that awe. The students that came out of his studios came up with very personal aesthetics and how they developed over time.
Oftentimes Arthur would just come into my studio unannounced and give me a critique. One day I'd been painting pictures of palm trees, and Arthur said, "Nissen," he always called me by my last name, "Nissen, you realize that there's never been a masterpiece painted that contained palm trees." So I said, "I'll go ahead and try it." He said, "Well, if you do, it'll be the first one." Another day, Arthur came to my studio, took one look at the painting I was working on, and covered his eyes with his hand, and said, "Nissen, you need to go look at some opera, or some theater, or some classical music, and then come back and talk to me. For starters, go listen to some Beethoven, and listen to Alexander Scriabin, and then tell me what you think." So I did. The Scriabin's music was just constant motion and noise, powerful bangs and scrapes. Beethoven was moderated with periods of quiet and periods of great dynamic power. My painting was so visually active. The point was so clearly made. Arthur was a very insightful person. He always had something good to say about a painting, even the ones he didn't like. And he was very persistent in checking back and making sure that you understood what he was trying to tell you. One time, Sidney Goodman was in my studio, and Arthur heard it and came in after Sidney left and said, "He doesn't know what the hell he's talking about." It's no wonder that Sidney's paintings look like they do, because he's always painting when he's got a cigar in his mouth. Sidney and Arthur were friends, but they always would go back and forth over my paintings and their understanding of them.
When I was in my teens seeking knowledge about painting, I was told to go study in private studios and then finish my studies at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. That is what I did, and with great fortune I was to meet Arthur DaCosta in the winter of 1978. Still living in Bucks County, I enrolled in his Friday night color class, and my life was changed. The first night of class, he did the demonstration using a revered palette. He painted a wonderful portrait from his imagination, and I knew I had to come here full time. I'm honored to have been given that painting, and I'm looking at it as I speak. He would always start off the night with a demo, and one night, as a semicircle of students looked on, he looked towards the crowd and started to paint. I was probably in the second row as I watched my face emerge on the gesso paper. I'm also proud to have that painting. By the time spring arrived and the semester was over, he came to me and asked me what I was going to do next. He suggested I come full-time. It was the encouragement I needed. It has now been over 41 years since I met Mr. DaCosta. Out of respect, I could never bring myself around to calling him by his first name. I can count maybe a couple people that had such an effect on my direction of my life, but none as profound as Mr. DaCosta.
Arthur DaCosta died in July of 2004. John F. Morrison of the Philadelphia Daily News penned an obituary entitled Arthur DaCosta, Renowned Art Teacher. Morrison wrote, Arthur DaCosta wondered what happened to his Frank Rizzo. He had finished the portrait of the late mayor and police commissioner around Christmas 1980, duly submitted it to the Philadelphia Art Commission for approval for hanging in City Hall, then heard nothing more about it. It wasn't until February 1982 that the painting was hung, without anybody bothering to tell him. He heard about it from a Daily News reporter. The portrait, somber, stolidly formal, as the reporter described it, embraced DaCosta's vision of Rizzo as an ancient Roman senator. I was thinking in classic terms and wanted to make a formal statement about him, DaCosta said at the time. I wanted to communicate an authority figure. Arthur DaCosta apparently was quoted once as saying, Frank Rizzo entered my studio like a Sherman tank. The Daily News reported this with a picture of a Sherman tank stuck in the mud and Rizzo claiming, I am not a tank.
A couple of us on the fifth floor hall where Arthur's studio was located also had studios there. And we decided to make a social event once a week of getting together and drinking blackberry brandy. One of those days, we had a door open, and out came Frank Rizzo and two beefy bodyguards. Frank went into Arthur's studio where Arthur was painting his portrait, and the bodyguards became our friends. And every time Arthur painted Rizzo's studio, the bodyguards came and drank with us. And one day when Frank Rizzo and the bodyguards left the hall, Arthur came out with a smile on his face and said, make sure you keep those two guys happy, because if this portrait goes south, Frank will tell these guys to work me over, and it won't be pretty.
In a 1982 Daily News article, Mark Manoff wrote, I think he did an excellent job, said Rizzo, who has expressed less complimentary feelings in the past about some of the modern art around Center City. It's an honor that the little fellow's portrait could hang in City Hall. It could only happen in America. DaCosta said the former mayor posed 12 times for the painting. I don't think I'm the easiest guy to paint, said Rizzo. I can't sit too long.
One day I went to his studio to see the portrait of Frank Rizzo he was working on, and he asked to see my right hand. It was a match, he exclaimed, and for the next couple weeks I posed my right hand for the painting of Frank Rizzo. I guess you can say I gave him a hand in the painting of Frank Rizzo.
I'm a portrait painter living in Tucson, Arizona, and I was a student of Arthur's at the Academy in the late 70s. Arthur was the most influential teacher for me. He taught portrait and figure painting mostly, and since I was this aspiring young portrait painter, I gravitated to him, as others did, for his skills and knowledge. I'll always be grateful. He set the foundation for the skills that I've developed as a portrait painter in my career. I remember the first time I went to an unveiling with Arthur. Arthur painted some very influential people in Philadelphia's social scene, and one of the portraits was of Dr. Shea for the Shea Eye Institute. So on the day of the unveiling, Arthur introduced me to some of the notable guests, including Walter Annenberg and Mrs. Pugh from the Sun Oil Company. And I remember watching the interactions as Mr. Annenberg greeted Mrs. Pugh and Arthur. This was, for me, like on-the-job training and really helped to prepare me in my professional life as a portrait painter. In the classroom, Arthur had this uncanny ability to talk to any student on their level. He gave good criticisms and usually found something encouraging to say about the painting. Once when I was working on a portrait and I made the background a nondescript color, he said to me, "Make that background an identifiable color, even if it's subtle." And so to this day, I'm very conscious about the color of the background, and I can still hear his voice saying that to me. Arthur often tried to help students out by hiring them to do things around the house or in the studio. And one time he hired me to help him build a floor-to-ceiling bookcase in his library at his home. He designed the bookcase with beautiful detail, and he figured exactly what we needed to buy, and he gave me the money to buy the lumber and the jigsaw. And after we were done, I was so proud. The bookcase looked really great. When I was cleaning up, I asked where he'd like me to put the jigsaw. And he said, "Oh, I bought that for you. That's yours." And I still have that jigsaw. I use it constantly. Now that I teach, I really appreciate his generosity, willingness to help students, and especially the skill of his instruction. These are the things that I try to pass on to my students.
Anyway, these opaque colors, which are only slightly different in tone from the background, serve greatly to separate the figure. And I speculate from the model, forgetting any rule, and just trying to find things that are happening there. And then, not completely neglecting or forgetting all of our labors and attempts to understand Impressionism, we try to find the colors that may occur.
Mr. DaCosta's process of creating portraits, as was the case for everything he painted, was to progress from large masses of light and shade and slowly build up detail over time. He created a large number of studies in various levels of finish. But even the simplest seemed to capture something of the character of his subject.
I'm Bo Bartlett, and I graduated from the Pennsylvania Academy in 1980.
I came into the Academy with prior experiences, learned some grisaille techniques in Florence, and so I brought those with me. DaCosta was not teaching that indirect way of painting at all. In those years, it was all alla prima, direct painting. So I did have some disagreements with him at times, but he was one of the teachers that had a real following of students, and I don't think that I fit into that following. There were plenty who did and wanted to. I was sort of a hunt and pick here and there from what knowledge I could glean from the teachers without going wholeheartedly in one direction. But I do remember Arthur telling me that I should go copy some of the paintings upstairs at the museum, which is what I did. Gilbert Stuart, Thomas Eakins, Henry Gilpin. James Monroe by Gilbert Stuart was the most educational in some regards. As a portrait painter, I was halfway through my first version of it when I showed DaCosta where I was, and he quickly grabbed a brush and started repainting the head without looking at anything. He wasn't looking at the Gilbert Stuart painting directly. He wasn't looking at a reference. He was just painting from memory. It's a beautiful study. I couldn't work on it after he painted on it, so I set it aside and started another copy. His understanding of systems of painting was a huge help for many students at the Academy. When I see one of his incredible still lifes, the simplicity of the choices, the atmosphere, the space painted between the object and the viewer, and the economy of means of the brushstroke, and the lusciousness of the colors, the muted tones. There was a very high aesthetic at work there. Time has shown me the wonder of the work of Arthur DaCosta.
I started the Academy in January of 1980. I was so fortunate to have been assigned to Arthur DaCosta for figure painting. The Academy itself changed my life, and he fine-tuned everything. One time he took us into his studio. It was like you were walking into a 19th century science lab, and he was the mad scientist. He was doing experiments of different kinds of whites, glazes, and mediums, and seeing how they reacted over time. One time he asked for a certain color. I had my paints with me, so I handed it to him. He just stared at it, and I realized, oh my God, this tube of paint, it's all crumpled up. It's got sticky stuff, medium, everything stuck to it. And he is a neat-nick painter. So he carefully wrapped a paper towel around it several times, squeezed out what he needed, and handed it back to me. One time I called Mr. DaCosta Arthur, and he corrected me. He wanted to be called Mr. DaCosta. And I had heard students referring to him as Arthur, but after he said it, I realized it was never in his presence. When he would go around and give individual critiques, he would get to me and put his arm around my shoulders, and he'd say, "Wilson?" And then he'd go on with his critique. I loved having him put his arm around me. It was fatherly. It also showed that he respected me as a painter, as a dedicated, serious student. I can see him to this day walking down the cast hall. He had a sort of waddle. He always wore a black smock, went down to about his knees, and it would sway with his waddle. He wore black shoes, must have had a rubber sole because you never heard his footsteps. But the anticipation in the room until he got there, you were going to stand at attention because the maestro is coming. He was such a generous teacher. He gave us everything that he knew.
I am an identical twin, and though some of my classmates knew this, Mr. DaCosta did not. Once when Jim was visiting from Pittsburgh, we had him pretend to be me. He asked Mr. DaCosta, "You are an excellent portrait painter. Can you tell the subtle differences in skin tones between one person and another?" "Why, thank you, Thornton. Yes, I can." After a few more questions like this, I walked in, to the huge delight not only of the other students, but Mr. DaCosta himself, who was greatly amused by our prank. After graduating, I was working on a painting of my friend Stan Beelan, and the wallpaper pattern was jumping off the wall. I caught a lecture by Mr. DaCosta, and he showed how Constant Troyon would put a velatura, or veil of thin paint, over the background to help the space recede. I went home and mixed some white with terre verte and a lot of medium, and rubbed it over the wall area. It worked like a charm. Mr. DaCosta was a wonderful guy to talk to, even if you didn't agree with him. I loved Kandinsky. He was not into modern art. If he wasn't a fan of something, he would put it down gently with humorous, faint praise. "Oh yes, that's nice, Thornton. It's very Byzantine and decorative." The Soviet Union was still around when I was in school, and I remember he said that Marxism was the last of the great Jehovite religions, leaving me to think that he had very little patience for any of these belief systems. I think his true religion was art. Before I started making films in 2007, I spent 7 years writing software to create abstract art and animations. I made sure I programmed in the functionality to digitally apply velaturas, glazes, and scumbles. What he taught us, we could take to places he may never have imagined.
And this is one way of starting. Usually what you do is make a kind of series of personal colors by mixture, which you find give great identity to your palette. Now here is our black and Windsor yellow. Just want you to see the tints of these. And this is the black and flesh ochre. This one is the quinacridone red and yellow ochre.
I am grateful to have landed at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts when Arthur DaCosta was an instructor there. He was a brilliant teacher and a mentor for many students, including me.
Hi, I'm Al Gurry. I'm chair of the painting program at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. He really ran a classroom that was a true educational environment.
I think he may have been misunderstood by many students, and his teaching methods distrusted by some of the other instructors. It is very important to understand that Arthur's objective was to teach us about different ways of painting, including how he himself painted.
Remember, this was at a time when most artists who taught wandered around the room and gave criticism and then went out for a cigarette on a break or a drink. Arthur had lessons, he had ideas about how we should sequence through things we were learning.
But not with the goal of having students end up painting just like him when they went on to do their own work. He really wanted us to use the information he was teaching us to develop our own methods and ideas.
He really knew things, understood things. He also was extremely kind to the students. He did demos. Almost no one did that either. It really tapped into the visual learning abilities of all of his students.
Some instructors don't ever want to talk about painting methods or do painting demonstrations, believing that would squash creativity.
His class demonstrations became highly prized and cherished. If you got to be the first to the trash can before he threw them out, you won the prize for the day.
Sometimes Arthur's demonstrations would go on for a very long time, and when he ended the painting session, he would say, "The mind can only absorb as much as the seat can endure."
Teaching was something he was born to as much as being a painter. Arthur had very strong opinions about art, but he always cared for the students' needs and attitudes first, even if he didn't agree with them.
In the ateliers that are springing up here and there, students must rigidly follow prescribed techniques. This, I think, is what some instructors at the Academy imagined might be going on in Arthur's classes. But what was really going on was that Arthur demonstrated color palettes and techniques from different schools of historical painting so that we would be able to assemble our own toolkit for making intelligent choices in our own work.
He had done a lot of research on the things he taught, and many of his paintings will have a note on the back saying, gesso made with such and such, this was the palette. He loved the works of Titian and Veronese. He felt as an educator that there was a whole wealth of history here that he needed to convey to his students, just because he loved it.
When I arrived as a first-year student at the Academy, I had almost no experience painting, and I had never painted in oils. I can't imagine how I ever would have learned how to paint if it hadn't been for Arthur's demonstrations of setting up limited palettes and full palettes and how to use different painting mediums. He demonstrated painting transparently, translucently, and opaquely, and we tried out white grounds, tone grounds, and colored grounds. We learned how to develop paintings both directly and indirectly, using a layered approach.
You hear alumni talk about him, even if they didn't really closely study with him, the impact he had. Some teachers were known only to their particular students, but everyone knew Arthur. That was also something unique because in many of the Academy teachers at that time, they were very partisan. If you didn't agree with them or didn't like their work, they wouldn't necessarily talk to you that much. But Arthur always did. He was very patient that way with everybody. Even though we all knew he had his own ideas.
When I was a student, and also afterwards when I was really struggling with my painting, Arthur always managed to tell me exactly what I needed to know at exactly the right time. And when he showed me where I had gone wrong, he said it in such a way, often with humor, that I was able to take it in and not feel bad about it. Arthur's criticism was always on target, occasionally curmudgeonly, but always kind.
He had an enormous impact on the development of students. Some of them through the direct means of what he was teaching and the kinds of representational work they were doing. And for other students who learned from him and translated that into the other kinds of aesthetics they were pursuing. So the things he was teaching related as much to non-objective work as it did to figural work. You see a great variety by students who had studied with him. This was so important to his legacy.
I remember a slide lecture Arthur presented on the first day of his cast drawing class. He showed us a brief history of drawing in which he explained how artists have developed different ways of drawing over thousands of years. It was through this lecture that I first began to understand the importance of discovering one's own individual approach to seeing and image making. Decades later, the skills I learned in Arthur DaCosta's classes still help me to figure things out every day.
I attended the Academy from 1978 to 1982. In thinking about Arthur DaCosta and my days at the Academy, I realized that I have more memories of him than of any other instructor because he was so extremely present and available to the students. Arthur was one of the teachers who didn't have to be sought out. He was always happy to give advice and encouragement. He also just plain enjoyed spending time with the students. I remember lunch times in the old Peel House. I'd sit in the tiny cafeteria with some friends, most of them men, and Arthur would enter whistling and get himself his usual meatball hoagie and then sit at our table. He'd hold forth on things like the harm he thought photography had done to painting because it had introduced cropping in a composition. Ever since then, I've loved playing around with cropping things in my paintings. I remember being fascinated by his test of a properly classical painting. Look at it upside down, and if the illusion of space still holds, rather than it becoming an abstract arrangement of shapes, then it's not overly influenced by modernism. Despite often thinking that I disagreed with him, I honestly can't imagine how different my years there would have been without him, how much less interesting and challenging. What I didn't love, and was too young at the time to make much sense of, was his tendency to favor his male students over the women. It's not that he acted as though he thought women couldn't paint well. It was that he seemed on guard, kind of wary around them. He'd give them his attention and share his insights in group settings, but one-on-one he was very standoffish. Women didn't seem welcome in the inner circle of his extended family of sons. Still, Arthur's influence on me has been enormous. Just one example was the time he told me that I might try beginning a painting in thin washes of color, choosing the base color of each object and then building up thicker layers. The initial color would influence the end result and be, as he put it, quite beautiful. That advice was so perfect for me and I use it consistently.
I remember feeling elated the time he told me one of my compositions was, quote, marvelous, and another time realized he was right when he called another composition of mine stupid. Overall, Arthur was just a fantastic presence at the Academy, had enormous passion for art, painting, and many other things, and had the most impact on my work.
Young people leaving high school often look for a role model, a parental figure, or sometimes just someone to rebel against. Art teachers often have devoted groups of students who seek them out for aesthetic or characterological reasons. At the Academy in the 1970s, this was common. Louis Sloan was much beloved by students interested in landscape, and he organized painting trips to the Catskills for his followers. Budding printmakers flocked to Martha Zelt. Marshall Glazier had a very expressive way of drawing and attracted a wide following. Arthur DaCosta appealed to those who wanted a classical training. In the catalog for a 2003 Vose Gallery exhibition, Arthur wrote, "To develop a basic curriculum that would withstand the onslaught of modernism on academic thought and methods and not hamper those students who greatly desired a strong classic basis to work by was my objective." Classmates who were not members of these groups sometimes came up with nicknames for them. Since Marshall Glazier's core group was mostly female, they were derisively known in a sexist era as the Glazierettes. Mr. DaCosta's core group had its own label.
He really had a flock, and it was called, I mean, like, I don't know if you guys called it that, but we would refer to you guys as the DeCosta.
Well, the only thing I would... It's a religious order.
It sounds like a religious order.
But what's wrong with religious orders?
Well, no, but I'm asking, was there a link to that kind of feeling? Like, you guys were young guys who are...
And gals.
And gals, but mostly males, right?
Yeah.
He was like your...
Rebbe. Yeah, a Rebbe is a spiritual leader surrounded by his, because traditionally it was his, Hasidim, by his followers. And I always thought that, in a way, that we were, without passing any kind of judgment, that we were like followers of a Rebbe. Of course, the different Hasidic sects, they think, the Satmar Hasidim over there, the other side of town, they're like full of crap. Right, this guy. I remember Arthur said, if he's going to come to my class and he's not going to listen to what I'm talking about, then what are you doing here? Yeah. I'm in this relationship with this guy, and I already understood that maybe this wasn't everything in the world, but this was a hit, unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Yeah.
There were women DaCostites, Deborah Deichler being one outstanding example. In the Vose catalog, Arthur stated, "From their very first days, it became apparent that Paul Dussault and Deborah Deichler were excellent students. Except in matters of procedure and handling, they needed no instruction. As far as the culture of painting was concerned, they were both strongly opinioned from the start, and each developed a new perception of representationist thought." Despite the presence of Deborah Deichler and some other women, Arthur's circle was mostly male, and that led some students to believe, rightly or wrongly, that it was a boys' club.
Remember that you test your sanguine color to see whether it's right. If when it is mixed with ultramarine it turns perfectly neutral gray, which you remember it did here. If you don't remember, but I'll tell you again.
I remember one of my early visits to Arthur in his home when for some reason I was left alone in the studio, looking around at all of these small figurative paintings, dozens and dozens of them surrounding me in this small room. I thought, I want to live in the universe of these paintings. I felt as if I were discovering myself, as if all the rest of my life had been a journey to arrive at this place, this imaginative place. Arthur's paintings gave me a feeling of recognition, and in that moment feel complete connection to something beyond my ego. This fleeting moment was far more complete than the intellect or thought. It was a conduit, forward and backward, beyond a sense of time. Once I was driving with Arthur, and I wanted to find out how it was that he discovered himself aesthetically. I kept pushing, asking how was it that he started painting the nude, and how was it that he began putting them in landscape settings, and why, and how. Finally, he said, I simply painted the pictures I wanted to see. This answer was so profoundly simple, and yet I don't think any of my artist friends would have ever said this. They and I were always painting with an idea of what we should be painting. Certainly every artist is inspired by their own muse, but there was something shockingly independent of outside opinion in Arthur's response, as if he was doing nothing more than serving his own aesthetic, imaginative needs. In fact, Arthur made almost no effort to exhibit his work. The only people who ever saw his figurative work during his lifetime were those few of us who were visitors to his studio.
Arthur DaCosta was certainly the most influential living artist in my life. The Academy catalog, when I was a high school senior, featured black and white images of instructors' artwork. All that the 17-year-old me knew was that I wanted to study with the man who painted the still life, 7 pairs. The subtle balance of static and dynamic forces, light and dark, a balance of space and matter. It deeply affected me. For Arthur, brushwork was as critical to artistic expression as any other pictorial structure. He wrote an article called Brush Response in Oil Mediums. What he was going after was this subtle balance between evidence of means and the illusion of appearance. And to him, this was the classic painterly ideal. One memory I have, you, John, and I, we were in basic painting together, and we had a beautiful redhead model with this wonderful creamy complexion, and I saw that you had mixed up this great big pile of flesh tone, and I thought, that's a brilliant idea. And I started doing the same. And as soon as I started doing it, Arthur came by you, John, and he said, no, that's not what you do. You need to make warms, cools, and neutrals. And of course, as he was saying this, I was trying to quickly get rid of my pile of paint. I think he saw it and just sort of walked by, didn't say a thing. And I remember he told me that there were 2 important things. Light and space. He didn't want you to simply think about light and space as a way to model form or compose a painting or establish scale or pictorial depth, but to plumb a different depth, the viewer's psyche.
I went to the Academy starting in 1976. Though I was not one of his close followers, I liked Mr. DaCosta enormously, and I learned a lot from him. I used to have him critique my work whenever I could. At one point, I and some fellow students formed a punk rock band. As you can imagine, our music was very different from the Mozart that Mr. DaCosta would sometimes whistle in class when he did his demos. We couldn't think of a good name for our band, so, on a lark, we asked Arthur. Immediately, he came up with The Urge to Kill. A perfect name for a far from perfect band, from a man with a sense of humor about the times in which he lived. Arthur also talked about the fact that we were all contemporary artists. No matter what technique you used or how you created your work, you brought the sensibilities of the time that you're living in. There was no way around it. One other fun thing, in the lunchroom, I was talking about how I don't particularly care about cars, but the ones I really liked were the muscle cars of the late 60s and early 70s. And Arthur kind of perked up and he said, Aside from Jaguars, those are the most elegant cars that have ever been made. He had enormous taste and he had opinions about everything, and that's what I think we all loved about him. It was always interesting to talk to Mr. DaCosta about any artist, past or present. No artist was above critique in his eyes. And it was really fun to hear him take apart the old masters that he didn't like.
I wasn't one of Arthur DaCosta's inner circle of students, but I did learn a lot from him. You know, we all benefited from his classes where we tried to use different palettes. That was a great experience. I was in Arthur's classes during my first and second years at the Academy. And at that point, I hadn't figured out what I wanted to paint or what my paintings were going to be about. I really couldn't paint my way out of a paper bag. I just wanted to learn at that point how to paint. And one of the things I remember Mr. DaCosta talking about was the different kinds of white paint and how to use them. Titanium, zinc, flake white, Kremnitz white. I remember him saying that he liked to use titanium white and lead white mixed together for some passages. And the term passages was another thing that he liked to say. The thing about mixing those two together was that you got the brilliance and the opacity of the titanium white, and then the warmth and the weight and the texture of lead white, and then various combinations of that. I thought about that years later when I was using white and mixing it in different ways, and I remember him talking about that. I picked up a lot of useful information from him, even though I didn't fully understand it at the time. I remember one day in a figure painting class, I had sort of a tentative start going, and he said, "Oh, you're painting that like a watercolor." And I said, I didn't want to get any white into the shadows. He had talked about how titanium white can make the shadow colors chalky. And he said, "Oh, everyone gets traumatized by that." I do remember Mr. DaCosta was showing slides of students' work, and he showed one of my paintings, and he said, "You really got something there, kid." And that made me feel really good.
Paul Dussault, the artist who was perhaps most influenced by Arthur, talks about his mentors, still lives, and figure paintings. Arthur was best known during his years at the Academy for his still life paintings. This was partly because the Academy owns 7 pairs and frequently exhibited it. His finished paintings were mostly still lives. In his home, he had several still lives displayed, but he did not have any of his figurative work on view. The still lifes are of a decidedly Italian influence. Their character is very sensuous and quietly joyful. They have a unique way of not appearing to be of any particular time period. Gentle, poetic light makes the objects visible, and they in turn make the light visible. It is a moment of interaction between the active agent of the light and the passive acceptance of the subject matter, each revealing the other. It is a moment full of dualities, active and passive, masculine and feminine, form and space, light and shadow, ephemeral and eternal. Arthur's still lifes feel classical, not only because of their traditional subject matter, but because of their extraordinary sense of order, balance, and stability. They are clearly the products of a very sensitive and extremely intelligent artist who is able to communicate the awareness of the history of painting in an entirely independent, authentic voice. They are a clear conduit between past and future. Beautiful examples of that uniquely human potential to capture a moment in time.
Arthur's figurative paintings are completely personal. Their direct influence is difficult to trace. Certainly, Arthur loved Titian and Poussin, but his paintings are quite different.
They are the product of a very contemplative imagination, intimate in the scale of the paintings and in the subject matter. They allow the viewer into a very private realm. The figures are not idealized. They represent individuals, unique characters embodied by specific models who Arthur found inspiring.
The heads always feel as though they are portraits. The poses are very unself-conscious. The figures are most usually in some repose or moment of sudden awareness. Their thoughts are internal, reflective, and their setting is a private space. They act in their setting naturally, comfortable in and regardless of their nudity. I have always felt that one of Arthur's themes is the discovery of civilization. The male figure in the landscape, alone, searching, and discovering beauty, often in the form of the female figure. This aesthetic moment, this discovery of the divine within through the awareness of beauty in another or in nature, brings about a sense of love. This love is the seed of civilization in its desire to be expressed. It is the discovery of the artist. What makes Arthur's figurative paintings contemporary is their focus on the individual. The figures in his paintings are not characters from literature or the Bible. There is no reference to Christianity or any religious faith. These paintings are not dogmatic or theological or didactic. They are unique individuals not representative of a group or tribe, naked to the world.
All right, I have established generally light mass, dark mass on the model. And having done that, I do next what nobody ever wants to do, and that is attack the background while the model is there. So those two, which we never mix together to make a perfect neutral, we put down in juxtaposition so that they vibrate chromatically. That is, we have somewhat neutralized sanguine and somewhat neutralized blue to make our chiaroscuro, which is so beautifully evocative of divine color that we're dying to paint on, right?
Arthur was always experimental, and he wasn't crazy about it, so he cut the painting in half, and then he just used that as experiments for varnishes. He would put one type of varnish on one half and different type of varnish on the other half to see what they looked like. And then he realized that he'd kind of made a mistake because it was actually a pretty good painting. So he re-glued the paintings and then covered it with a single coat of varnish. And that illustrates a lot about Arthur and, kind of his high standards for himself and others, and also this experimental person.
Ready to ruin a painting.
Oh yeah, for the sake of and that's it. Yeah.
So what I did here was find a cool color that's in the same context as the whole light mass, and I just put it on. If necessary, just put it on there for the hell of it. But get off of the monochrome effect in the full light. So even if you end up finishing the whole thing monochromatically, you'll still be pretty safe, because your eye will be so exquisitely tuned up, to the warmth and cools, that you will develop the color very beautifully. You only gradually begin to understand the significance of glazing in a painting. It takes a long time to be able to predict how much light a glaze will cut off from the layering. And when you have that knowledge, you use it wisely.